Welcome back to Talking Justice 2017. How is digital disruption impacting on individual rights and social justice? This panel discussion will explore the impact of digital disruption on traditional journalism. Is everyone now a journalist? Can social media hold authority to account? Will the rise of fake news undermine our trust in the media and its ability to keep those in power accountable? What are the implications for individual rights and social justice? We have three great speakers who are going to give you their perspectives. We have freelance journalist Paul Wallbank, we have digital strategist and company director Joanne Jacobs, and Chris Zappone, the foreign news editor at The Age. Now, Paul is our first speaker, Paul Wallbank. He's a freelance journalist who contributes to Fairfax, News Limited and the ABC, as well as various international outlets. For over 20 years, he's been covering how digital technologies are changing society and business. And he's been looking at where this all leaves the traditional media. And last week, he appeared before the Senate Select Committee on Public Interest Journalism. Would you please welcome Paul?
Thank you very much for that. I've got to admit I'm standing before you with a bit of an admission of failure, because had I been standing here, say, 10, 15 years ago, I would have been talking about how the great opportunities were in the digital economy, how going online was going to mean a new era of citizen activism, holding governments account, transparency from corporates, all of that. As it turns out, in 2017, I was completely and utterly wrong. That cyber utopian view, if you like, was completely and utterly flawed. So I was wrong. Many of my colleagues were wrong, that what we've seen in the last few years has been a concentration of power both by governments and by corporations, affecting both our individual rights and our corporate rights, and our rights as consumers, rather. And that's really changed the way that we operate as citizens in society, and how as consumers we are. So I'll just have a quick overview of what's really been changing there. And I've got a clip that I'd just like to show, just to give you an idea of the sort of data that's been gathered on us.
How are you?
I'm doing fine. Barack.
What?
Barack Obama.
Fine. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
I'm so proud.
Oh, you're very kind. What's your name?
My name is Mary Jane Marie.
It's going to be famous one of these days.
Well, I appreciate you.
I
guys.
was never the likeliest candidate for this office. We didn't start with much money or many endorsements. Our campaign was not hatched in the halls of Washington. It began in the backyards of Des Moines, in the living rooms of Concord, and the front porches of Charleston. This campaign can only be about me. It must be about us.
So I'll just pause it there, because this really tells us a lot about the way data is being collected on us at the moment. You can see, and you saw that through that clip, just how each of these people, first-time independent voter, individuals who are long-term Republicans, Democrats and so on. It's really, when you watch this whole clip, and it's available on YouTube or Vimeo, and if you just Google for it, it's called The Art of the Possible. It was actually used as an advert at the Cannes Lion Advertising Festival in 2009, where the Obama campaign drew with the Queensland Best Job in the World campaign for the best global marketing. And that really shows just how they were using data. I find it's quite innocent in some ways compared to what we've seen today, particularly looking at Obama compared to what's currently in the White House. But one of the things with this is that they collected a lot of data on voters, put that through the machine, and were able to really tightly focus the Obama campaign on those swing states and swing seats to get over the line. Today, they're using one of the Republican campaign operatives that I saw just before the US election last year. He was boasting how they have 300 points of data on every American citizen, minimum 300 points of data. So you think it's not just how long they've been a registered Republican or whatever, it's a lot deeper than that. And of course, when you overlay social media on top of that, a lot more data. And that opens up a lot of scope for misuse of that data. And we saw this here in Australia in spades with the Centrelink Not My Debt debacle late last year, where we saw the government actually targeting a group of people, a large group of people, the poor and disadvantaged in this country, for their own short-term political aims and in the name of budget reform, budget honesty, for want of a better term. The way that the government used that data against their own citizens really should be a wake-up to all of us. And then later on, of course, one of the people who was writing about how that data had been misused on them had her data, pardon me, released by the department and the minister's office to the Canberra Times. And I'll come back, hopefully I'll have time at the end of this to come back to the journalist side of this. That was then used against her to discredit her. And one of the departmental heads justified this in a parliamentary committee on the grounds that it was to protect the agency's reputation. So this is a big warning call to all of us as citizens that we need to be holding the public service and politicians a lot more accountable with what the data is that they're collecting on us. Now, it's not just government data either. We're increasingly seeing the private sector gathering this sort of data as well. With the Internet of Things, we're seeing that things like kettles, cars, your smoke alarm, your burglar alarm, your door lock are all being connected to the internet and are all subject to the terms and conditions that you've got from the corporations. There's a story just recently that I covered on John Deere tractors, where the tractors under Australian law you can't do anything to the software at all. Under US law, there's an exemption to the prohibition on you tampering with software. So you can do it on your own car or your own vehicle. So the farmers who are finding that if they've got a John Deere tractor, they have to use a John Deere software supplier to do any work on them, they're downloading Ukrainian software, pirated software, onto their tractors so they can maintain their tractors. Now, it's not beyond the ken of John Deere to turn around and disable those tractors. And we've seen this happen. Many of you may have had this with your inkjet printers, where if you've tried to use a third-party printer cartridge, it doesn't work. These are the sort of things that we're seeing the corporates doing there. And of course, in the social media space, we're seeing Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all of these sucking up more and more data about us and on-selling them to governments, to agencies. And again, we saw with Amazon, the Kindles actually disabled 1984, George Orwell's 1984, because of a glitch in their algorithm. So these are the sort of things that are really changing on that. Now, for the media side of this, what we've seen in the last 40 years is this very cheap journalism. We saw Roger Ailes, the founder of Fox News, died 2 days ago, and he was one of the founders of this pre-digital demonising of, again, the poor, the vulnerable, the weak. A lot of what we discussed this morning on the panels here, and that's been a real theme in journalism and increasingly in politics, as we saw in the youth justice panel talk about demonising juvenile prisoners. And this is going to be increasingly a problem that we're going to have to push back on. So just to wind up, because I'm conscious that we're going to go to questions, I've painted a pretty bleak picture on what there is there, and I'd describe myself as a pessimistic optimist. In the short term, I'm quite pessimistic about where it's going, with reason, I'd suggest. In the longer term, I'm optimistic about it, that this will work out. It always is the case when we have new technologies come in, be it the motor car, be it television, be it the telegraph, whatever it was. We've been through this before over the last 2 centuries. But we all need, as citizens, to be standing up to the people in power, to the politicians, to the public service, to the media, and saying, you need to do better. And indeed, at the ballot box, be forcing our politicians to do better. So on that positive note, I'd say get out there and make it clear that you want your data more protected, and you want to have much more control over what your data is used. So on that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Our next speaker is Joanne Jacobs. Joanne is an award-winning digital strategist and company director, and she's the managing partner, along with Gavin Heaton, of Disruptors Handbook, a firm that facilitates innovation. She is on the board of Code Club Australia, as well as the New South Wales Digital Advisory Panel. Please welcome Joanne.
So while Paul's been looking at data and our concern about reporting and how reporting data itself could be problematic, I'm going to take a slightly different tack and look at the issues with what's changing in the media and how the media has been disrupted in such a way that it has got to the stage where even if you have the right data, your audience won't necessarily believe what you have to say. This is a problem that has come out from the fake news era. But as you can see, this is the first Viscount of Northcliffe, Lord Northcliffe, once described journalism as a profession whose business is to explain to others what it personally does not understand. Now, in an era where there is fewer, this is what I'm going to be covering, trends and forces impacting on media and consequences for social justice. But in an era where there are fewer journalists than ever before, fewer sub-editors who, frankly, sub-editors had a very important role in the history of journalism. They were people who gave the sanity check to the journalists who didn't know what they were talking about. But in an era where we've got fewer journalists, we've got a fragmented media landscape, and that's much more so than just moving from newsprint to radio to television. We're talking to a point now with the internet where there are so many channels for reception of news that individuals can choose which view they actually want to hear from the news they get. So it is never an impartial view that people are receiving. Increasingly, people are choosing a specific perspective when they are choosing their news. We've got less interest in Fourth Estate ideals. I'm not sure anybody knows what the Fourth Estate is anymore. If you don't, it was the first, the Lord's spiritual, Lord's temporal, the Commons, and finally the Fourth Estate. Or, in other words, the Fourth Estate was supposed to keep all of the other ones honest. We do have another quote in Australian history, but I won't use that particular pejorative term. Can I just ask, show of hands, who recognises this logo? How many of you own one? This is a Ferrari logo, for those of you who don't know. This is the reason why the advertising model is broken. The corporate world has only just triggered that, in fact, what they have been sold for 50 years has been a scam. Advertising is never going to, or brand awareness and brand identity has no correlation whatsoever with sales. It never has. There's a correlation between awareness and intention to purchase. There's a correlation between intention to purchase and sales. There is no correlation between awareness and sales. So the very business model upon which journalism and media was based is so badly broken, it will never be fixed. This is something that mainstream media still don't understand. The fact that they haven't been able to find a new business model is frankly baffling, but it is something that is going to change the way that we receive news. I could do the same with a whole bunch of other slides. I could do it, with, everyone recognise that one? Yeah, you will know, you probably don't know, you know that one, that one. Most people don't eat it, or if they do, they die. So these are the forces that are operating all on media. So the impact of those forces is that that accuracy in reporting is in decline, because with fewer journalists, with fewer people actually gathering the information that is required, the information is being nudged, slightly moved towards the perspective that the audience wants to hear. So accuracy in reporting is declined. Media trust is in decline. Time spent with news media is in decline. And there's plenty of research to back all of this up, of course. If you look at errors, percent of errors over time, you see that there's a gradual increase in the number of reports where there are errors as fewer fewer journalists are out there, and there is more skewed reporting. Trust in Australian media just keeps plummeting and will continue to do so. Time spent in reading news over the last 4 years came down in the UK by about a quarter. So really, when it comes to the trust in messaging at all, it is so low now that we've got to a stage where audiences feel that they control what they believe is correct. There is less consultation of media as a source for accuracy, for general knowledge, for understanding. What is increasing is belief in myths and susceptibility to scams, belief in pseudoscience, anti-vaxxing, people who don't believe in climate change, acceptance of alternative facts. This is the only thing that's on the rise at the moment. And when it comes to disrupting journalism, there's nothing like facts being incorrect disrupting journalism. I'm going to show a video too because I like them and because of the fact that I think it should be compulsory, this particular video. But the consequences, I want to finish with this video, but the consequences of this is that awareness engagement around social justice is at risk. Now, you've heard some messaging even today from people here, which I totally respect and admire, which is go and talk to your local member, go and write a letter to the editor, go and engage with news radio. The problem is the audiences of these news sources are not going to believe you, no matter how many facts you give them. But there is a solution.
When MacArthur Wheeler learned that lemon juice was used as invisible ink, he rubbed it on his face and confidently proceeded to rob 2 banks. When the police found him, he was shocked. His disbelief was equal to theirs. He had even taken a picture to check he was invisible. The case inspired experiments by Professors David Dunning and Justin Kruger. They found that the least proficient students dramatically overestimated their own ability. The skills they lacked were the same skills required to recognize their incompetence. Dunning found that the incompetent are often blessed with an inappropriate confidence buoyed by something that feels to them like knowledge. Could the Dunning-Kruger effect explain some of Trump's actions? We'll get to that, but another cognitive bias certainly shapes his ideas. Salience bias leads the media to focus on the most shocking and negative news, including stories that represent the worst 0.1% of immigrants.
They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists.
In fact, immigrants reduce the crime rate. Over the past 30 years, the incarceration rates for Americans born in the US have been 2 to 5 times higher than for immigrants. Cost of our distorted view may include a $20 billion border wall. And can you spot the salience bias in Trump's budget priorities? Bottom of the list is the Environmental Protection Agency. Air pollution alone causes 200,000 early deaths in America each year, but this isn't news. Trump's top priority is defense, with a major budget hike. The US already spends more on defense than the next 7 nations combined. It owns 10 of the world's 18 active aircraft carriers, and on average, the US ships are around twice as big as the rest. But war is always in the headlines, and Trump proposes to increase spending by almost the equivalent of the entire Russian defense budget. When the media is on the attack, an incendiary statement is a powerful diversion, and repetition has a strange effect. In 1968, 2 groups of people were shown nonsense Chinese-style characters, some more frequently than others. 11 out of 12 times, the characters that were shown more often were thought to have more positive meanings. The effect may be due to our brain's preference for things that are easy to process, much in the same way that we prefer sharp images and clear sound. So when Trump repeatedly says he'll bring back manufacturing jobs, people start to believe him.
We will bring our jobs back, Sean. We're going to bring our jobs, as sure as you're sitting there, we are going to bring our jobs back into this country for the first time.
Unfortunately, 86% of those jobs were in fact lost to automation. But how do we explain Trump's claim that climate change was a hoax created by the Chinese? 97% of climate scientists agree that humans are causing global warming, but Trump appointed someone who denies this to head the Environmental Protection Agency. It's the Dunning-Kruger effect in full force. It affects everyone, from bank robbers to presidents. With any given subject, complete ignorance breeds confidence. So how do we help people see the truth about immigrants and the environment? Psychologists believe our opinions are like protective castle walls, and simply pointing to facts can be futile. Experiments have even shown that people will defend decisions that they never actually made. In one case, people were asked to choose the most attractive faces from several sets of pictures. The pictures were then secretly swapped, and the people were asked to explain their choices. 75% didn't notice the switch and gave reasons for the selections. But don't give up hope just yet. Experiments have identified something that's more convincing than facts alone. In 2008, most Republicans were against bringing troops home from Iraq. A group of them were shown statistics about a dramatic fall in violence and asked if it might be a reason to bring troops home. They were not convinced. A second group was asked to remember a positive memory, a time when they felt good about themselves, before receiving the same statistics. They were much more open to changing their minds. FBI hostage negotiator Chris Voss notes that a simple smile triggers an automatic response that makes a real difference. It's not a tactic Trump is known for. And with the media thriving on his incendiary style, the descent into doom-mongering seems unstoppable. But it isn't, because while we see constant gloom, the real world is getting better and better. Over the past 30 years, the number of people living in absolute poverty has declined from 53% to 17%. And in 25 years, infant mortality rates have dropped by 50%. Violent crime has dropped dramatically in the US and many other countries. And around the world, people are receiving far more years of education than ever. When Trump raises fears of immigrant terrorists, keep in mind that since 9/11, no one has died in a terrorist attack by immigrants from the countries he wants to ban. Meanwhile, the Environmental Protection Agency has prevented hundreds of thousands of early deaths from air pollution alone.
Department of Environmental Protection. We are going to get rid of it in almost every form.
The greatest enemy of knowledge is not ignorance. It is the illusion of knowledge.
I love that video because of the fact that it does actually say there is a solution. It is to engage those audiences that are most likely to disagree with you in a way where they feel empowered. If we can do that, we can perhaps disrupt the disruptors. Thank you.
Thanks, Joanne. Our third speaker is Chris Zappone. Chris is a foreign news editor at The Age in Melbourne, where he wrote some of the first stories in the media about Russian cyber interference during the US election. He joined Fairfax Media in 2008 as a business and economics reporter, and previously he worked at CNN Money in New York and at Fortune magazine. Will you please welcome Chris?
I've been asked to talk about the rise of misinformation and so-called fake news and what effect that can have on accountability, trust, and ultimately justice in our society. Before I begin, let me say something that probably goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. Everything you're about to hear is my own opinion and doesn't reflect the opinions or views of Fairfax Media. Now, although I'm going to talk about fake news, I actually consider that term a bit of a misnomer. Fake news is, to me at least, a euphemism popular in democracies to describe propaganda, misinformation, or even coordinated influence campaigns using the news. I think we often use this term because it's hard for us to cope with the reality that what we rely on as news can be so easily manipulated. And it can be manipulated by forces fundamentally opposed to an open democracy and the rule of law. When you think about it, truly fake news, alien landings, hoaxes, rumors, as individual events in isolation, can be examined and disproved. And this is all important in the context of the court. But of course, we don't consume most of our news in that setting. Increasingly, we don't even consume news in a thorough way. The deluge of information is far too great. So is the speed of transmission across TV, the internet, and social media. More threatening than obviously untrue facts is what I call half-fake news. That is, news that is willfully distorted or tainted to dupe readers into believing and acting on a certain falsehood. This is information that in many cases appeals to people already inclined to believe it, urging them to accept false or damaging conclusions, particularly in politics. Social media giant Facebook recently released a report admitting that the platform was used for coordinated information operations. Facebook defines information operations as actions taken by organized actors to distort domestic or foreign political sentiment, most frequently to achieve a strategic and or geopolitical outcome. Once upon a time, this sort of thing would have happened only in war, to deceive an enemy on the battlefield. Today, the internet allows these information operations to be aimed at civilian populations during peacetime. The more sophisticated ones have a deep psychological element to them. That's what's happening now. Even as Australia is not necessarily the intended target of such campaigns, it is the recipient of them, both because we're an English-speaking country and the internet is a globalized platform available to all. The viral nature of news means that what works as an argument in the UK or US can easily be used here. Similarly, news, events, arguments, memes, and culture created in Australia is recycled elsewhere for the same purpose. Maybe you've heard the case of the Labour MP Anne Ali, attacked on social media for allegedly refusing to lay a wreath at an Anzac Day dawn service in Western Australia. The claim was later debunked, but not before being shared rapidly with people inclined to believe it. It fed into a series of weaponized narratives about Muslims in Western society. But the problem of fake news gets murkier still on social media. Researchers are finding that the willful spread of conspiracy theory can have the effect of undermining trust in media and fact by the public. That is, in all media and all facts by the public. During the recent US presidential campaign, accounts on social media, aided by automation, bots, actively promoted the notion that Hillary Clinton was dying, was dead, or was replaced by a body double. Factual nonsense. In a courtroom, none of it would hold up. But in the endless drumbeat on social media, this torrent of conspiracy theory about Clinton's health helped loosen part of the public's grip on political reality. It takes the public to a place which says it's impossible to really understand what's going on. When Clinton finally did stumble with pneumonia on the campaign trail, the internet went wild, and the traditional media weighed in, giving a conspiracy theory undue credibility. If even the mainstream media was reporting it, didn't that make the issue a little true? Or so the thinking goes. In this climate, errors in reporting by traditional media can be conflated with outright lies being peddled elsewhere to suggest to the public that all facts are opinions, all reporting is equally suspect. There is already a sense of political disengagement driven by shifts in economics and technology. Politicians who label real news as fake for a short-term gain aren't helping the matter. But add propaganda, misinformation, and conspiracy into the mix, and the disillusionment will only get worse. If people can increasingly pick and choose their facts, the consensus for a functioning democracy corrodes. If we can't agree on what the common issues are that we all face, we can't really have a sensible political debate. The kind of information war strategy we're seeing from Russia in the global sphere urges a crude, inward-looking nativism in which people of different backgrounds are told their interests fundamentally differ. Hot emotions are championed at the expense of sober facts. This propaganda arouses suspicion of our fellow citizens in our society. In a courtroom, the big risk isn't that the notion of truth will necessarily break down. The bigger risk is that the sense of community will. The community relied on to produce fair trials to produce fair juries for fair trials is the same community that seeks justice and fairness in their political choices. If we come to see all politics in our society as a cynical exercise in power, eventually the legal system will be seen the same way too. One of the features making modern propaganda effective in the 21st century is the fact that a society does not know how much it has consumed and accepted until a crisis is upon it. That means perhaps the biggest risk for a just Australian society is how far along we've already traveled in the path of accepting false and damaging narratives. Building up awareness to this risk now is crucial. Perhaps to fight the worst effects of misinformation and propaganda is to increase the focus of how and why a successful democratic society works. Because for an open democracy like Australia, we really are the sum of the integrity of our institutions. For that reason, there's much good in discussing these matters now, getting them out on the table while people's ears are still open. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yep, Chris. Chris, thank you very much. We're now going to have a conversation with your questions. I might just ask the first question. I'm wondering if there's a legislative response to this. In Germany in March, the Justice Minister in Angela Merkel's government announced that they are going to create legislation that says that if social media fail to take down something which is obviously fake news and there's been a complaint about it, then you can be fined up to 50 million euros.
Good luck with that.
Good luck with that. It was interesting. It was in response to a series of kind of fake news. I think back in January, there was a report that Middle Eastern asylum seekers had set fire to a church, and as it turned out, they'd just let off some firecrackers, and there was no attack on a church. And so there'd been a series of total fake news in that area. So good luck with that, Joanne. That's not going to work.
I think legislation's too slow for that kind of response. This is the nature of what's happened to news, because it is now mediated through social media or mediated through digital channels, is that we are needing as a community to become more educated. And I think all three of us have said that in one way or another, that actually it is a community responsibility to ensure that we are engaging with the right information. But it's very hard just to, as Stephen Fry's video says, it's very hard simply just to say, well, it was just firecrackers. Because there will always be somebody who disagrees with that. No, they were trying to set it alight. That was just the front. So again, it becomes an important aspect to give that person a chance to express that, but at least to be able to slowly, as a community, to try and sway the opinion.
To counteract
every single one of us has a responsibility.
But I do feel that there's value to looking at some sort of legislation, if for no other reason to show that it's important to the society. I mean, the idea of letting social media platforms, and very powerful ones, let their networks just be flooded with this misinformation, I think it sends the wrong signal about the value of truth and facts in a society. I don't know what kind of legislation they could actually push through to affect it.
And that's
because
my problem.
Right, and I agree with you that would be part of the issue, is that it's just going to be like stopping water from going downhill. I mean, it's still going to go. It's still going to flow. But I do feel that there is a place for looking at this. It's just not clear exactly what it is at this time.
I think there's two very critical points we should be looking at on this too. And that is, first of all, why just social media? I mean, we heard in the juvenile justice panel this morning about certain news outlets here in Victoria exaggerating and in some cases making up gang-related violence, stories about gangs and so on. That's been going on since the rise of tabloid television, with the current affair in the United States, since the early 1970s. So This is something that we've seen in the media that predates the digital changes that we've seen. The second point I'd make is that when having the government define what's fake news or false news or whatever is very problematic. I mean, you think about how, say, Erdogan in Turkey would use that. You see Putin, how he would use that. Equally, just today, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist in Malta has been kicked off Facebook because the Maltese government has complained about the series of exposés he's been running about that government. So you can see how this becomes problematic too for the social media platforms, that if an Erdogan, a Putin, a Trump, a Turnbull, whatever, complains and says, hey, that's fake news, they could quite easily shut down real news.
I think the German proposal is that if you have complained to social media because you've been harmed/defamed by the fake news, so there's that, at least that connection to a real person as opposed to just government policy. But I totally take your point that that is
model
abuse.
law makes more sense in some respects than local law. Perhaps at an international level there should be some kind of document that is urging media players to be accurate. But the reality is it's not just the media players who are producing this crap. You know, we're talking about individuals who are creating stories which then get picked up by lazy journalists.
But I mean, and that also speaks to an issue with the invention of social media, which reflects the values and expectations of the societies that created them. Which is the fundamental idea with social media is that we can connect online, we can come together over certain ideas and share things. Other countries outside of this tradition have looked into that and said, you know what, social media, we can turn it upside down. We can say social media is what we use to divide that society, and that is the issue. I mean, for me, that is the issue. Looking at it from international news, international politics, is that we might have this expectation of truth or this presumption that that's what we're seeing on social media. But there are other outside forces that are taking that and really subverting it and causing real trouble. And I think that might be what the Germans have in mind. And to be fair to the Germans, to take your point, Paul, if you roll back, talking about current affair, if you roll back, going back decades in Germany, they had the same in the 1930s, and they have this history of the worst excesses of propaganda, and they know exactly how bad it can get. So I think for them it's probably a very sensitive issue.
Absolutely. Well, it was really interesting because also earlier this year there was a bloke called Anas Modamani, and he was a Syrian refugee, arrived in Germany about 2 years ago, and there's a famous selfie of him and Angela Merkel. And it became an iconic kind of image of that moment in time where Germany opened its doors. Ever since that moment of celebrity, that image has been used to connect him with every single terrorist attack in Western Europe. And he took Facebook to court earlier this year, saying you got to, I told you 1 million bloody times that there's all this stuff out there, and you just continue to allow it. And the court said, well, really, really sorry, but there is no legal mechanism for addressing this. So it's about the disinformation at a national level, but it's also about the harm experienced at an individual level of being labelled a terrorist quite constantly. And that rubbing up against freedom of speech, which I think you've all accurately identified as a real issue. I'm just wondering, do we have any questions from the audience? I've got hundreds of things I want to say, but yeah, please.
Thank you very much for your comments. I feel worried that I might be falling into a conspiracy hole myself as I look at the actors on Facebook and the propaganda that's being used and the tools and sophistication that we're seeing from organisations like Cambridge Analytica and the way that not only those military-style propaganda interventions being used on civilian populations during peacetime to sway the outcomes of democratic elections, but also those same devices that can be used to sway our emotions. We've seen the well-publicised Facebook experiments on us to see whether they can change our mood, and they can. And we've also seen those results. I mean, what hope do you have that we are not actually falling into a dystopian hole of actors controlling our minds and our democratic futures?
I'm of the opinion we're already there. Can I just share a story on Facebook? About a year ago, was it, Paul? I actually came across an image that I thought repeatedly as an advertisement. And I thought, gee, that looks like me, that image. And I kind of thought, this is really creepy. And I actually felt really I kept seeing it every time. And I ended up cutting out the image of the girl and putting it into a post and saying, is it just me or does that look just like me? And everyone came back to me and said, oh my God, I thought it was you. They've been receiving this advertisement. And because they thought it was me, they were reading the advertisement. So the subliminal activity is already there and it's already happening and it's already really creepy.
Absolutely. This is it. We also see the conspiracy on the rise, as you were saying, and the belief in the conspiracy theories, and you're like, am I having a conspiracy? Or are we actually already there?
Well, I mean, the advantage of fora like these is that you do at least get a chance to engage in face-to-face. You break down the technology, you get past it, and you get a chance to engage. However, the reality is the people who attend these kinds of events are already in a single mind, have a certain similarity of thinking. So there are limited opportunities for us to address this.
Mm-hmm. I would add to that too that we're in early days with this. So social media platforms are really only 15 years old. The web itself, 25 years old. So we're still coming to grips with this. When we're having this discussion about media models, I keep making the point that if we were having that discussion 100 years ago, the topic would be, how do you make money out of radio? Within 10 years, David Sarnoff had found out how to do it, and we had the television and radio advertising industries, which were arguably one of the most successful industries of the 20th century. But until 1935, we really hadn't sussed it. But even then, when that came along, we had all of that subliminal advertising. We had Orson Welles scaring the pants off people with Martians invading. And that was people trying to get their heads around the new broadcast medium as it was in the early 20th century. And I think we're in a very, very similar position at the moment with the web and particularly with social media and the whole phenomenon of fake news. And the term makes me uneasy because there's so many complexities there. But I think that is part of this thing where in 100 years' time people will look back at us talking about it and go, gee, weren't they pretty silly 100 years ago? Mm-hmm. But to us, it's a real problem, and we're struggling with it.
And I just would say one of the factors that we face now is, you're right, it follows this historical sort of trend of being uncertain about the media that we're facing and how to respond to it. But also, we live in a time of absolute information overload, and that changes the way that we think. When you compare it even to 20 years ago, which would have been a time that a media critic like Marshall McLuhan would have said that was information overload, but it seems quaint, right? It seems very quaint compared to what we have now. And now you have information coming on your phone, it's on the lift, it's on the screen, it's on the the back of in a cab and all that. And it is going to take a while for the human mind to work out ways to navigate this and to have a secure place to understand the world around them. And people are working on it. I mean, it is something that people are working on. But I can understand why you would fear that there's that there's a web of of conspiracy out there to find on social media, and whether or not you're being drawn into it or not.
I think the opportunity. I'm going to sort of disagree with you right now, Paul, because I think the opportunity actually is in artificial intelligence. And I know that sounds like a technological utopian speaking, but eventually, at the moment, algorithms are crap. They're written by they're written by men, and they do tend to. They're often written by white men. Therefore, there are clear biases that are coming through in some of the algorithms that are being written right now. However, those will be resolved, and I think the best opportunity for impartiality and impartial reporting will actually come from machines rather than from people.
But it's the question about how that information gets back to us. It's not just the information, it's about receiving the information. And
just on that, I mean, National Public Radio in the US about 2 years ago had a great story on automating journalism. And they put up a prize-winning sports journalist against a reporting algorithm to report a baseball match. Now, I've been to baseball when I visited the US, and it bores me to tears. And I don't understand it. Sorry, Chris. Baseball does nothing for me. But you listen to the report from the journalist and the report from the machine. The NPR commentators all said, gee, the machine was a lot quicker, but the journalist did a much better job. And I was thinking, no, I actually preferred the machine version because there were none of the cultural references that the journalist used made any sense to me because I'm not an American and I'm not interested in baseball. So he'd written all of these cultural references that mattered to Americans. So Americans, that was very good reporting. To me, it was meaningless. So this is the thing with the artificial intelligence. It strips out a lot of that cultural bias and demographic bias, if you like, because, again, that algorithm, I wouldn't say it's just written by white men, but white men from a certain part of southeastern England or the Bay Area of the US. They're the people that are writing that algorithm, which is tilting it that way. So, and again, going back to this fake news and the rise of Donald Trump, an affluent white guy from Manhattan gets to the top based on those models. That tells you something about who's designing those models. So I'd agree with you.
Okay.
We have a question sent in by text. What might be possible for social media to be used as a force for good to improve outcomes for minority and marginalised groups and their causes? Is it a double-edged sword? Does it work for good?
Absolutely. This comes back to my cyber utopian view of 15 years ago, that I really thought that would be what we would be seeing now. I'd say that has happened to a degree, but people like me probably didn't anticipate just how that double-edged sword would be used the other way and how effectively it would be used the other way. And that's really... So I think for those groups, it is a great tool and it's a great opportunity to be pushing awareness of what they're... getting those groups together, but equally it helps those reactionary groups get together as well, as we see online. That as we see with the alt-right, the rise of the alt-right, it's very powerful because it's a lot of like-minded people coming together. Individually, you'd laugh at them on the street, but when they all come together, there's suddenly millions of them, and they've got a very loud voice once they're on. And social media gave them that voice. But no, I think that the answer to that question, it is a really powerful tool that you should be using.
Journalism, generally speaking, as the graph showed, that they're more likely to produce negative stories than positive stories. There are lots of positive stories about social media being used for social good. I'm part of a group that's associated with TechFugees, so this is groups of... I run hackathons, so I bring people together that are technologists with companies or organisations or ideas, bring them together to try and solve problems over a very compressed period of time in a hackathon. The TechFugees is not one of my hackathons, but I'm part of the community where groups of people who are interested in looking after new refugees in Sydney, and it's actually happening in Melbourne as well, are coming together over a weekend trying to work out how best to serve new arrivals to Australia. And that's entirely a social media driven process. It's been the most marvellous process. It's created extraordinary opportunities. One of my favourites is the Walking Tours of Sydney project, so that a company will pay a refugee organisation to get people to tell their stories to people in a walking tour around Sydney. It's just marvellous. It's a way of telling stories. It's a way of developing that compassion, getting that engagement. These are fantastic initiatives, but they are not getting the media coverage because they're not bad stories.
And just on that social media angle with it, with TechFugees, because that originally was founded in London and then was picked up in Sydney by people who'd seen it on social media. So, and then it's spread from there. So you can see how social media has been a very positive force.
But I would just add, I mean, it's a reflection of the culture that wants that. So it's the presumption that we can use social media to help people in need and to integrate them into society. That reflects the people that are using social media. But the social media itself, in a way, is sort of morally, I mean, it's technology, it's sort of morally neutral. It's what and then you can have the alt-right, the weaponized narratives that would point to the same people saying, no, this is an ill in society. We cannot have refugees in our society. So it really is. I think the key thing in trying to make social media work for us is making sure that our culture expects this. Make sure that we're using social media to develop the initiatives that are the culture that we want to have.
Yep. Yeah. Interested to know if the panel has heard about the Bendigo Mosque debate and their thoughts about how easily groups who have opposed it can mobilise through social media and ultimately jeopardise freedoms. What can we do to challenge this?
I know of the scenario. The people, if I'm speaking about the right case, the people who were coming together were from Australia's United Front.
I'm not sure exactly who that.
Australia United, or whatever it's called. But they were a right-wing group that came together to suggest that there should not be a mosque built in Bendigo. This, to me, is an example of not necessarily social media, but specific alt-right style groups utilising every resource that they can to get as much media coverage as they can. Now, the reality is that there was, I'm not sure whether this is the exact scenario, but there was a situation where there were people who were faking being part of the Australia United group, and the media were reporting them as if they were part of this group, and they were just.
But were they based here or overseas?
No, here in Australia. And this was a group of people who were just
claiming
basically trying to get their face on television, and because they knew the journalists were that. Frankly,
unable to fact check.
Yes, unable to fact check is the word. Gullible. That they were able to present the story as if there was more support for or more anti-mosque kind of coverage than there actually was. And the issue is not necessarily, you're never going to eliminate those voices, but if you can balance the reporting and if you can actually utilise social media to gather a group of people together to say there were 6 people there, or there were 20 people there, there were 50 people who were supporting it. If we actually got the real stories, again, we have to actually massage this news reporting in such a way that the alt-right is at least heard, but only in the context of the other side of the story. And that other side of the story has been lost.
Do you want to say something?
Well, I just would say, in order to counter, basically, for want of a better word, propaganda about the mosque in Bendigo, you have to recognize, I think, that it's a globalized platform. So any sort of nonsense that's coming out, nonsense stories, will probably ricochet around the world. I haven't researched myself, but to other English-speaking parts of the world. So be aware of that, and don't hesitate to use authenticity in your postings about it, and to say, I am from Bendigo, I am in Bendigo right now, I'm seeing what's happening, and it's not this. And also, don't hesitate to use the search terms that they would use. One of the biggest things we talk about, choosing your own news, sometimes there'll be conspiracy theories that are rising up on the trending, charts at the same time that there's real news. So this happened recently with the Trump, the Comey, Trump-Russia investigation, while there's also a conspiracy theory about somebody named Seth Rich. So what I'll do is I'll put out actual hard news, that's credible news that can be verified, but I'll include the hashtag for Seth Rich. So hopefully, it's like floating a bottle in the sea, but hopefully some of that actually intrudes into these streams of propaganda or misinformation that people are receiving. And I would encourage, if this is an issue in Bendigo, I'd encourage you to take control of that Bendigo hashtag if you haven't already. And you see images of your city being trafficked around the world, and far out of context, you seize it and you come back to it and you take it and you make sure that they know that in Bendigo this event is going on in this way. It's not going on in the way that's being described. That's what I would suggest. And
again, this is the early days of using this medium, so we're still coming to grips on how to use it. So with that case study of the I think it was actually in Melbourne where an ABC reporter interviewed a bunch of comedians who were
Yes.
who were pretending to be part of a right wing, and they were portrayed as being part of the alt-right group that were protesting. But I think this is what you're saying, Chris, is exactly it. This these sort of countermeasures, if you like, propaganda countermeasures to get into these feeds, get into these streams, get onto these groups. This is part of that early evolution of how we manage that. It's a really interesting thing watching the PR industry because as somebody who came into the media quite late in life and is seeing the media models collapsing, if you like, I think I'm I'm a fitter and turner by trade in an earlier life too, so I think I'm sort of an economic typhoid Mary when it comes to industry disruption. But watching that, I'm seeing the PR industry, which is probably where I should move to next. They are really struggling with this whole how to deal with this, because that traditional mass media model where you could take a journalist out to lunch and get a full-page spread in the Financial Review or on Radio National or something a few weeks later, that's pretty well gone by the by now because of that shortage of resources that Joanne described in her presentation. So they're struggling with this too, and of course social is completely blowing up that PR model. They cannot deal with this. So, and again, politicians, they are really struggling with this. The reason why we're seeing this demonisation of juvenile offenders is part of the media ratcheting up the stories as much as they can to get those eyeballs, to get something on the 6 o'clock news, and then the politicians are desperate to find this because they've got no other way of getting their messages across either. They long ago gave up selling hope and the future, and now they're just reacting to an increasingly hysterical media.
Well, my next question is there any point in politicians telling the truth anymore? How can we keep our local paper honest?
But what is truth? Is truth unchanging law? Sorry, no. I'm quoting from Jesus Christ Superstar, actually. But it's no. If politicians are telling the truth, they're still telling the truth from the perspective of their party in most cases, or at least their initiative. They can tell the truth. The issue is whether or not it's going to actually get onto the news.
And that's, I was just going to say, that's one of the issues. If you want to be invisible online, just say reasonable, measured things. And, and that's the issue with a politician saying something that's responsible. They become invisible. Just one observation. We look at Donald Trump. He's a master of attention grabbing, right? You know, attention seeking, attention grabbing. Imagine, imagine a benign Donald Trump. So imagine a politician who was making these gaffes, but he wasn't necessarily victimizing, segments of the population. He wasn't necessarily corrupt, but he was doing stuff that he was constantly finding himself, constantly making himself visible on social media. That might be something of the future. I mean, if you look at the current foreign minister in Britain, Boris Johnson, he has a little bit of that, where he is somebody that makes these statements that he just looks sort of somewhat ridiculous, but he's actually...
Always looked like a buffoon.
He does, but he's actually at the same time, a credible politician to some degree, right? Does that mean more than Donald Trump, I'd suggest? But this idea that if you act in a certain way and you speak in a certain way, you can possibly attract more attention in social media. And I think that there'll probably be a new generation of politicians to learn that. That will learn that lesson. And
well, I think too, and this actually comes back to my parting thought in my presentation, was the modern politicians are really only telling us what they think we want to hear. And you're seeing it with the federal government at the moment, where that last budget was basically going through the focus group list of when Mark Textor asked those voters in marginal seats in Western Sydney, outer suburban Melbourne, South East Queensland, what worries you the most? They collated the top 10, top 20 things, and you saw the federal government went through that right down to the good old-fashioned meme of all the dole bludgers are sitting around smoking dope, so therefore we're going to test the water. I've got a feeling that it's going to be Malcolm Turnbull's seat that's going to come back with the most scary drug residues in the water, but that's another issue altogether. But the thing is with that is that they're not rewarded for telling the truth. They're more rewarded for pandering to our fears today. And so this is what Donald Trump did brilliantly. Brexit did brilliantly. Here in Australia, it's a bit more complex because our political parties probably shows. Well, what happened here was that Pauline Hanson came along articulating a lot of the stuff that Trump and Brexit, and 10 years ahead of that, by the way. And
doesn't make it a good thing.
But the Liberal and Labor parties picked up on that and took that in. I mean, demonising and brutalising refugees has defined Australian politics now since 2001. That's 16 years. And that has been the defining issue in Australian politics. That's from focus groups, because the focus groups are going, oh, there's all these terrible refugees are going to put halal in our milk or something. That's the people out there are believing that, and the politicians and the shock jocks are responding to that. So it's not so much telling the truth. It's more responding to our fears. I think that's what we as citizens have got to be doing, is saying, no, we are not scared by this. Mm-hmm. This does not define us. This does not... brutalising refugees does not define our community. Putting juvenile offenders in supermax does not define our community, does not define our expectations. That's the thing that we need to be getting out to the media and to politicians. So not so much telling the truth, but telling them what we want from them, and not just accepting what's been spoon-fed to us by, as I say, an increasingly hysterical media and increasingly desperate politicians.
Can I just add, and it's also about telling a larger story about democracy. I mean, one thing that's happened in the past 30 years is people stopped, or since the end of the Cold War, right, they stopped telling the story of democracy and of a liberal democracy and what it means. And we need to get back to telling that story. And part of that story is that we're a society that's made up of many different parts, but we come together for these things in common. You don't hear that. So instead you hear fear of immigrants, or fear of rights for gay marriage and the like. And instead you need to hear that the big picture is that in democracy it takes all kinds. And once we start telling that story again, or once politicians start telling that story again, then we'll have a counter narrative. You have something that you can meet a lot of this fear with, or you can blunt a lot of this fear with.
I have a question. A lot of that conversation can come from kind of the trusted news brands, but they're of course all going down because of the economics, and the people who are doing very well are the social media people, Google, Facebook, what have you. I'm wondering, should they be taxed in some way, and some of that tax money go to fund some of those news organisations which can actually do the journalism and get an income stream via this tax, and have that put out into the world and hopefully be trusted and listened to. Is that one way forward?
I think it's a completely legitimate discussion to have. It is. I mean, it's the primacy of the state over corporations. Otherwise, you have corporations that create these products that can just absolutely undermine the legitimacy of the state, and then they pay nothing for it. I mean, it's I think it's a legitimate conversation to have, definitely.
You can tax anything, but I mean, I think I'm a little confused as to why the government hasn't considered alternative ways to get news out as well. ARC grants are produced all the time for research projects which almost never get reported. Why is not a certain amount of any kind of grant money allocated to people who are skilled journalists who can report on things that they don't understand, but give them the chance to actually produce pithy, deep, meaningful information that will actually inspire. The fascinating thing about social media and about some of the online content that is being released is some of the most read content is quite long. It's more than 10,000 words. The highest read content online is long content. Now, if we can start to produce really good quality journalism around programs, around social programs, around ARC grant content, anything that is actually being created for the country should actually have a journalist associated with that program in order to communicate what comes out of it.
Paul?
I think the whole future of journalism, funding journalism, so I testified to that Senate committee where they were discussing this in Sydney on Wednesday and in Melbourne yesterday, and this is a big problem. I've got some problems about the definition of a journalist. Do you have to work for the Herald Sun or Fairfax to be a journalist? Can you be a food blogger and be a journalist? This is on who gets that money. That troubles me. But I think really the bigger issue here is that we are struggling to find a new model for funding news organisations that, again, 100 years ago would have been having this conversation about radio. How do you fund radio? You can't charge people for capturing the waves coming over the ether. How do you do that? So we're in a similar thing at the moment. There's merit to taxing Facebook and Google. If I were Google or Facebook, I'd be probably looking. I would be, as a strategic thing, saying we'll give $1 billion a year in journalism grants or something like that. Maybe, I don't know, give it to the Pulitzers, the Walkleys, whatever. Just as a gesture of goodwill, so the government doesn't come in and do it. Force us to do it. But I think it's part of a much bigger question about how do you fund journalism, because at the moment that model is hopelessly broken, as Jo showed in her slides.
And do you think people like Fairfax and even down the track News are headed for oblivion?
Well, the question, I posed this question on my blog the other day, that are News and Fairfax journalism essential to the future of journalism, or the ABC for that matter? Maybe not. That's just in news alone, we've seen the Melbourne Herald became the Herald Sun. Did that make a great deal of difference? Not really. There was the Melbourne Argus 50, 60 years ago. That went. The Bulletin went. BRW's gone. Has it made a bit of difference? Journalism goes on, but so I don't think journalism's really tied into those whatever masthead or outlet there is. But finding a way of funding it is a real problem at the moment. I mean, until this time last year, I was a regular writer for The Australian. That all dried up because the freelance budgets dried up at The Australian. So yeah, that was a big chunk of my income gone. That's a lot less PR people ringing me too, but that was a good thing.
A lot fewer nice lunches. Yeah.
Yes, that's...
Chris,
well, I was just going to say, I think if you watch what's happened in the United States with the Trump, with him being elected president, then you have this sense of crisis, which has actually benefited organizations like the Washington Post and New York Times that were long losing money left and right, losing subscribers. Suddenly there's this huge uptick in subscribers to these traditional legacy media outfits that are adapting to the new media environment. And I wonder if Australia is, obviously Australia doesn't have a Donald Trump, but if Australia has a crisis to come that forces people to start thinking about this, to start thinking, yes, there is value in people whose job it is just to dig around and see what kind of news that they can get about what the government is up to or what people of power are doing. And I don't know if we've had that crisis yet, or maybe we're having it in a different way. Maybe the Fairfax strike served as a bit of a wake-up call, and then you had the parliamentary inquiry into journalism, the future of journalism. You know, these things might be happening in a sort of roundabout way, but obviously news consumers here can see what's happening on the world stage, they can see what's happening overseas, and they can see the risks of a society without a somewhat robust and vital journalism segment, whatever the without saying which companies they would be. But the public can see the value in people doing this as a job on a regular basis, I would think.
Two really good questions. One which reads off what we were already talking about. Is there a role for our local paper? Can they survive?
It's tough. The local journalism is, particularly here in Australia, where we've centralised. In fact, that was part of my submission to the Senate committee. That because really, what drove that Senate committee is that the federal government, is proposing to change the laws so there can be further centralisation in the media markets. And for regional Australia, the centralisation of broadcast and print has been a disaster. There's no other way to describe it. For democracy and for just reporting on what's there. But there's a global problem here as well, that basically Google has destroyed the business model of the local newspapers of putting classified adverts. That's completely gone. Pretty well the only thing that's keeping local media going is the real estate advertising. And then, I mean, of course, Fairfax with Domain. Where I live in Sydney, the newspapers are still that thick, but it's 98% property adverts for nice houses on the harbour. What happens when that dries up? That's gone as well. In regional Australia, that luxury isn't even there at the moment. So there has to be, if we suss this business model out, and I'm as clueless on what that business model is as anybody else. And if I had a hint, I'd probably have an island in the Bahamas. But this is part of that business model that we've got to figure out, is how do you fund local community journalism? How do you get that local newspaper back? Again, my cyber optimistic side of things, 10, 15 years ago, I thought that the web was going to reinvigorate local reporting and local journalism. And in fact, it's done the opposite. That's, it's just got harder and harder, and one person with a blog reporting on local affairs is not the same as having a local newspaper.
Joanne?
Again, I'm baffled by why there isn't another business model. Why local newspapers have to actually make their money from advertising. Why can't they make money from, can't it be a tax that is deployed to all the businesses in the community? If they're going to appear in this newspaper, then rather than being charged for advertising, it becomes part of their annual local promotional round that actually funds the newspaper. Why can't it be run entirely by subscription? Why can't it be run entirely by a state government? Okay, all right, you then have a situation where you talk about the fact that then you might have government or state control over the content.
It sends a shiver down my spine, to be honest. I mean, I can't speak of how incorruptible the Bendigo City Council is, or whatever the local council is here, but I'd look at some of those Sydney councils and the idea that they could have control over the local newspaper sends shivers up my spine.
There would seem to be a way to do it without necessarily giving the government control, but I think that you know, the internet, what makes news work on the internet is having an exclusive knowledge of something. So clearly there's got to be some market for exclusive knowledge of events and news in Bendigo, and it's just a matter of finding what that is. And I agree to your point, both your points, that, you know, we're just not sure what that is yet. It's just not clear, but there still has to be a demand to know, for people in Bendigo to know what's going on in the other part of town, what their neighbours are doing. It's just a matter of finding where that is. And the scale might be smaller than it used to be, just based on economics and the Australian economy moving from manufacturing to information. But it seems like, I mean, my hunch is that there would be a market for it at some level.
I agree.
Next question. Where does podcasts with following and analysing stories, i.e. Edward Snowden choosing Glenn Greenwald to release information and selecting what sort of information was released? Does that make sense? No, let me try that again.
Try it again.
Where do podcasts with following and analysing stories fit in? I think that's... do they...
So podcasts are another news source, and some of them are based on a radio program anyway, and they are, if you're talking about the fact that Snowden was able to release some content through an online source because of the fact that he was protected in a way that if he'd gone through a mainstream media brand, it would have been much more difficult. That's certainly true, but then again, The Guardian was involved with which was a mainstream media brand, was involved with the initial release of data anyway. So I think podcasts are interesting because of the fact that there's an audience that is highly engaged with that content. You're really talking to people in a way that you can't. It's quite a visceral response to podcasts. But the sad thing is about the stats is podcast listening has actually gone down in the last few years.
Really?
So, it's collectively gone down, but there are fewer sources that people are listening to than they used to be listening to, partly because of the fact that there's so much more content that they can consume. So with the rise of Netflix and other visual content, some of that quite personalised content in podcasts, or it feels personalised anyway, has been in some decline, unfortunately.
It's really interesting. I should just let you know that at the ABC we get ratings. We also get podcast figures. nobody really looks at the ratings these days. Well, they do, but I'm certainly, and most of my colleagues are a lot more interested in the podcast numbers. And I'm sure that's really what management look at when they're deciding whether to recommission a program at the end of the year. So, yeah, that's the way the technology has transformed and saved Radio National.
Yeah, and for Radio National and for ABC Local Radio as well, because most of the ABC stuff I do is with local radio around the country, and the same thing there too, that they've got the same metrics are creeping in now on what's been podcast, what's been downloaded. The problem, though, with podcasts, and a number of my close friends have been involved in podcasting ventures, is exactly the same as any other independent media venture, and that is, how do you fund it? There's not enough people to subscribe to them. Of course, this isn't a problem for the ABC, and on top of that, you're repurposing existing programs anyway that were going to go to air anyway, and you're actually adding value by podcasting them. But for the podcasters themselves, the ones trying to make a buck out of it, it's really, really difficult because you're constantly on that treadmill of trying to find a sponsor, of trying to find subscribers. It's really, really hard.
At the ABC now, there's a massive focus on online people who are kind of digital producers, and a lot of it is about trying to promote the content and get the content out there. So the program makers are getting pretty cranky because a lot of their budgets are going down. Whereas it's the people, the Generation Z producers who are out trying to disseminate what they do, and that's where the resources are going.
Another thing too with podcasting, one of the great strengths with that is that it makes, particularly for radio, it makes it much more evergreen, much more reusable content. So just listening to the Juvenile Justice panel this morning, Radio National had a great story on that 2 weeks ago, which is really worthwhile listening. If you're listening to the panel this morning, want to get more insight onto exactly the issues they discussed, Radio National really went into that. And as a consequence, and the ABC does a great job of this, but it's taken them probably 10, 15 years to really understand how podcasting works. And again, it's relatively early in that technology on how they can use it to leverage the talents that they've got and the strengths they've got within the ABC.
And I don't know if you can hear it, but on Radio National there are now programs which I think are really podcasts which just have an on-air advertising component. Basically it's an advertisement for the podcast.
Download This Show is the classic one.
Absolutely. Yeah. What's very interesting, Chris, just to give you also a sense, podcasts, in terms of Radio National, there's a whole band at the very top, and they are programs which don't have a strong national content, so kind of the health and the science and the philosophy programs. Not a lot of local content, massive international audiences for these podcasts, because they're being picked up by people across the world who speak English, and they are the ones which really blitz it, as opposed to ones which, like mine, which are more focused on kind of local issues. So that's really interesting that you can kind of get into that supranational space of the media. Sorry, Chris.
No, I was just going to say that the rise of podcasts. I mean, I understand that they've had a bit of a renaissance, right? That they initially rolled out years ago, and then there was sort of drifted down. But then there has been some uptick, and there's been more popular ones that have been
the popular ones,
right? That have been
up.
Right, and it's sort of an item in themselves that have drawn people to the format. But I think it just reflects the world we're in. With radio, it's by appointment, and people's lives don't run on appointment like they did 30 or 40 years ago. So now people have iPhones. They just download it, and when they have a free moment, they're waiting somewhere. They're in the car. They can. So I think it just reflects that evolution that we're going through.
Olive, thanks very much. First off, I'll tell you that my media is not working because I tried to SMS you 3 times and it hasn't happened. So pardon me while I read this. I talk to a lot of people about the importance of judicial discretion in sentencing and the long-term harm done to incarcerated individuals and the community as a whole by a lock-them-up, tough-on-crime mentality, which is advocated by much of the media. I put the facts and figures of careful research to them, and their perception of the reality changes not one jot. Am I wasting my time?
No, No, you're not wasting your time. But again, it comes back to what that video, the reason why I love that video so much is because of the fact that it is about getting those people, just that moment, get them to feel good about that past memory about themselves. It is putting that into that context. And sometimes it's completely about bringing those people together and say, tell me what you did last weekend. What was the thing that you really enjoyed the most about last weekend? And actually getting them to tell the story first. And then to actually somehow bring that story, put that into context with what you were then going on to talk about. And wouldn't it be wonderful if somebody who was incarcerated had a chance to actually have the experience that you had last weekend? I mean, it might be a bit that might be a bit too harsh. But, those kinds of things, if you give them a chance to have that, it's more likely to change their mind. But you're right, just giving them the facts is not going to move them at all. That's really the thing that I've learned recently is that because I've always been a lover of facts and always wanted to change people's minds. But every time I try and do it, I just get nowhere unless you sit down and actually allow them to tell their stories and feel heard.
Very brief response from either of you, from
Sorry.
the other two, and then we'll get on to this last question, which I think...
you have my sympathy. In the short term, I don't see it changing, that the media, particularly the tabloids, are going to be driving this more and more. We've got a leadership deficit at all state and federal levels in Australia at the moment who are only going to respond to that sort of panicky sort of stuff. Build a wall, throw them in jail, deport them, whatever. I wish you the best of luck. I really hope you're successful.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, if it's a matter of justice, you'd never stop speaking out for it. But at the same time, there is this realization that this sort of behavior by media and politicians has been around for, it's not just the past 10, 20 years, it goes way back. So, it's just one of those things that you have to continue to fight for, I would say.
Last question. I want a really quick response. It's going to be hard because it's a good question, but it's one which brings us back to where we were at the beginning about data collection and making ourselves a target for certain kinds of information. And the question is, how can we better protect our individual rights when so much of our life is dependent on data collection?
So the first thing is be careful about what you're giving out. I mean, I know that's a trite answer, and it's really difficult because, particularly in this world of connected devices, Fitbits and connected cars and what have you, smartphones in particular, it's hard to watch what. But I think we've really got to be hard on the lawmakers to say we value our data, we are concerned about how it's using. It's got to be used better. This is what I was getting at with the Not My Debt Centrelink debacle and the terrible follow-up with the release of personal information. This is showing just how serious the stakes are. So hammer your local representatives, your federally state representatives, and make it clear to corporates that don't look after your data that you will take your Telstra have a leak, tell them you're taking your business elsewhere, that sort of thing, because we've got to start being proactive.
Joanne?
Encryption matters, and no legislative or local action against the use of encryption should ever be permitted. We must allow our own use of encryption.
I would just say, as the economy moves into an information economy, almost, primarily, it matters more now than ever. You are basically the sum of your data, your digital profile. So, as Paul said, it's something that you need to be aware of. You need to be aware of what you're connecting to. Encryption, you need to be aware of that as well, and the use of that. And this is the new world that we're in.
The new world that we're in. That's all we have time for today. Would you please help me thank our panellists? It was a terrific conversation. Freelance journalist Paul Wallbank, digital strategist and company director Joanne Jacobs, and Chris Zappone, the foreign affairs editor at The Age. Thank you.